and welcome to this episode of Mind the Gap with me, Emma Turner, and Tom Sherrington. Today we're going to be reflecting on our interview with Jethro Jones and everything he had to say about his work over in the US. And then we're going to be talking about some very interesting topics. Tom assures me that he's got lots to say about broccoli and leadership, which I'm very interested to hear about. Then we're going to kind of unpick the latest headlines in the UK about the cancellation of some of our statutory exams. And then we're going to dip into some of the latest releases from John Catt that are linked to Tom's work, Tom and Ollie's work with their walkthroughs. So in terms of our interview with Jethro, I absolutely loved talking to him. What an amazing bloke, not just because of the Steve story, Tom, where he's talked about everybody called Steve in the school, but he told us so much about how to identify and act on issues that you find in your school as a leader. So what did you take from the interview that we did with him, Tom?
I took away lots of things. The Steve story, which was fantastic, where, you know, he talked about somebody who called everybody in his school Steve because there were too many students to remember their names. So he just said, "Hi, Steve, how's it going, Steve?" And it just made everyone feel like they belonged. And to be honest with you, it's one of the things that sometimes I think about my time as a head. And I've got this image of talking to a group of 4 girls. And this girl said to me, "You don't know my name, do you, sir?" And it was so awkward because I really didn't. And I knew the other 3, but she kind of knew that I didn't know her name. And I felt really sad. It was like there was no way out of it. And it was just a terrible moment. But if I'd been able to say, "Oh, come on, Steve," or something to sort of diffuse the situation, or kind of like, I knew about her, to be honest. Because I knew sometimes you know about students that you know a bit about them, but I didn't know her name. And that was for her painful. So anyway, I didn't teach her and I did teach the other 3. But that was funny. But so he was full of those stories. I'll tell you the thing I was also impressed with. This is in terms of us doing this podcast. Jethro has done 350 episodes. That's insane, isn't it? So he's been reaching out to other teachers through his podcast for 7 years on a weekly basis. I think that's inspirational.
Well, you can tell that from his book as well, because I think I said in the interview that rarely do you read something that's so rich in terms of anecdotes and references to other educators. And it's an absolute delight to read, because there's just so many, there's his sort of continuous narrative throughout the book, but then there's so many other voices that you can hear echoing all the way through it. It's absolutely fascinating to read that book, and so many different perspectives that he manages to pull together in one continuous narrative, which I absolutely thought was brilliant about his book. But I love the idea that he has about how he addresses problems at both student level and teacher level and then community level. He really puts his schools at the heart of the communities that they serve, which I thought was brilliant, and not just for the canned food drive either.
Yeah, so that was a good one, wasn't it? So this thing, that to me was a classic example of where, you know, sometimes people talk about leadership in quite grandiose language, let's be honest, and it can seem a bit removed from like the nitty gritty, but he's totally the opposite of that. So he had a couple of examples, one of which was this challenge in a middle school he worked in where the focus had sort of become on students being rewarded for how well they supported this canned food drive, a kind of charity community event, to the point where they're almost being graded on how many cans of food they were able to collect or whatever, rather than the academic achievement. And he felt this was a bit of a conflict because their stated aims were about academic achievement, but de facto students were more motivated by their support for the canned food drive. And he was trying to kind of resolve that tension. I thought that was a really good example. Have you ever come across anything like that?
It's interesting about how much he writes and speaks about a school's identity and how that particular school's identity became raveled up in the canned food drive, which I'm guessing is a little bit like the Harvest Festival that we might have over here. But I really enjoyed listening to him talking about making sure that you understand when you're a leader what your school actually stands for and how it's different from maybe the school down the road. You know, what do you actually stand for, and being really, really clear about this is what we do here, this is what we stand for, this is what we don't do here. And I loved his work that he's done on analysing schools' kind of mission statements and value statements, and it's quite kind of tongue-in-cheek when you read his book, when he gradually unravels these, like say, these grandiose statements and says they don't mean anything.
It's true. But I think one of the challenges leaders have, and I've certainly had this experience in the past, where you're trying to project something to sort of the outside world, to sort of say, hey, come to us, we're a great school, we're on the way up. You have to put a sort of positive message, because no one wants to sign up to a school which everyone is saying it's a bit rubbish. You say this is, we're going, but actually if you know deep down there's imperfections that you're sort of trying to sort out in the background, it is a balancing act. So you sort of put this sort of positive message forward, but you're hoping that the reality meets the rhetoric, and sometimes it doesn't. And he was really good on that. The other really detailed thing he talked about was this thing, his design concept, and that's one of the key theme of the book really is to develop schools he sort of talked about the difference between leadership and design, and leadership being more sort of, design being more kind of intentional and strategic. And he talked about prototyping, which is quite interesting. And then the example he gave was about how to streamline the lunch queue. And I thought, I loved how prosaic that is. Like, we're really not being sort of too grand, are we, when we're talking about how to streamline the lunch queue?
Yeah, but Tom, when you're a school leader, if lunchtime's gone badly, that's every afternoon absolutely ruined. So it's the focus on what might outwardly seem unimportant that actually has a huge impact. So sorting out lunchtime, sorting out behaviour at lunchtime, and oiling the wheels of the afternoon kind of mentality of everybody and the mood that they come in is really important. And I just love the way that he attacks and unpicks every aspect of the school day for every user, be that the user who's the parent, the child, the teacher. I really like the fact that he looks at things from everybody's perspective, not just kind of the teaching and learning, what goes on in the classroom, but actually what goes on in our school community. I really enjoyed hearing about that from him.
Yeah, me too. And I think people will like listening to him. He's sort of super down to earth and got a lot to say. And he reminded me of, I don't know, there's so many sort of nitty gritty conversations, as you're right, sort of a nice to puncture the great intellectual thinking around, teaching and learning and curriculum design. You think, lunch queue, that kind of stuff, the can drive. Anyway, so I thought it was interesting to talk to him, and hopefully people will pick up that episode, which is the one before this one, in our podcast.
Now, lunchtime brings us neatly on, Tom, to what you might have for your lunch. As in broccoli, because just before we came on air, you said, I want to talk about broccoli fractals. And I thought I was hearing something, or was slightly more sleep deprived than I normally am because of my children. And so you're going to enlighten us about your leadership thinking linked to broccoli fractals. So I'm just going to sit back for a minute and let you unleash the broccoli, Tom.
Okay, well, I tell you why I was thinking about this is because I realised as we were talking to Jethro, and he had this design concept about leadership, it reminded me of our conversation with Robyn when she was on, and she talked about builders, and her whole thing is about build, and teachers and leaders being builders, and I like that, because basically what she's saying is, you've got to have people who are trying to, you can't mandate everything that happens in the school, but what you need is people who are prepared to create the thing that you want it to be. And you can't do that by yourself. So you have to create a team of builders who are with you on the journey. And it means that some people who aren't necessarily on side straight away, you kind of can't worry too much about them, but what you need is your kind of vanguard of builders. So these are these different leadership sort of metaphors going on. And I was thinking that one of my favorite ones, was when I heard it on a training course presented by a guy called Dave Harris, who was the head teacher, and he was on Twitter at Bravehead. That's his handle, and he told us about a business writer called Margaret Wheatley, and the idea of organizational effectiveness being about designing the repeatable unit that you then sort of amplify all the way around the school or the institution. So there's a kind of, if you look at this up, if anyone listening to this wants to Google Romanesco broccoli, it's a kind of broccoli where you've got these sort of spirals, and they've got their little pyramids. and they're absolutely beautiful. So each little pyramid is tiny, but when you look at the whole broccoli, it's just a sort of, it's like a pyramid of pyramids of pyramids, and each little bit is reproduced sort of from the sort of the unit, and it's gorgeous. So you get spirals within spirals within spirals, and the actual original kind of defining unit is actually quite specific. It's like this sort of tiny little pyramid, and it's the way it's. So what he was saying is, so in a school you can't control every interaction with students and kids. You can't control every lesson. You can't control every time the receptionist meets a visitor. But what you can do is define the kind of unit that's reproduced, the kind of ethos, the things which we care about, which matter, which then, if you get those right, if you're really clear about the way we do things at a kind of a very sort of clean and clear level, then people get the principles that apply to those situations, and then you'll get the sort of reproducing thing going on. So because this is how we do things here, this is how I'm going to talk to you in the lesson. Because this is how we do things here, this is how I'm going to meet you at the door when you come as a parent, and all those sorts of things. And I thought that was interesting. So that to me it's a really interesting concept, this idea of working hard to really think, what is that reproducible element, like a fractal, which kind of we see at different scales, at a whole school scale and down to a kind of micro interaction between a teacher and a student scale. And can you make a link between them, like the spirit, the ethos, and it can be to do with things like academic rigor and a kind of quite a pushy kind of intensity, or it could be a kind of caring, sharing kind of vibe, or whatever. I mean, there are quite specific differences in certain schools. Anyway, that's what it's about. That's where the broccoli fractals comes in. What do you think of that?
I love it, and it links to what Jethro was saying as well about having that kind of strapline or that motto or whatever you want to call it, that actually means something, because that's exactly what he was saying as well, about that you need to have something which translates into every area of the school, every interaction, every conversation, every enactment of whatever it is they're doing, with that teaching or learning or talking to a parent, or out on a school visit somewhere when we used to be allowed to leave the building and go to places. But yeah, I think establishing that as a leader and communicating that as a leader sounds like a really straightforward thing to do. This is what we do, this is what we stand for. But actually then translating it into those little broccoli fractals of actually go, this is what we stand for, but how would it look for every member of staff and the way that they work? How would it look for every department? How would it look for every child? How would it look for every subject? It's a really interesting concept to think about, kind of replication and duplication, but in different scenarios. I really like that, Tom. Thank you.
What's quite interesting, and I've got a quote here because I'm reading this out, but because I wrote it down on an old blog I wrote, it's about 6 years ago. But this is what she said. So she says, in true fractal fashion, agreements do not restrict individuals from embodying them in diverse and unique ways. So self-similarity is achieved not through compliance to an exhausting set of standards and rules, but from a few simple principles that everyone is accountable for, operating in a condition of individual freedom. So that's the point. So when you're in your classroom, you've got a lot of autonomy, a lot of freedom. And as long as you honour the principles, you can kind of do things your way. So it's also a recipe for people kind of feeling a little bit liberated, provided that the key kind of ideas are honoured. And that's quite, I find, motivating. You don't want to feel like there are 57 rules that I mustn't bend from, and that applies to teachers, teaching as well.
It just occurred to me when you were talking then, it's a bit like being in a family. Like, as a family who live in a household, you all kind of know how you work in that household, you all kind of know what you stand for, what you're about, what your morals are, but you all behave slightly differently, have different interests and a different focus. I mean, I'd like to think I'd behave slightly differently from my 4-year-old, but he's very clear about what's important to us as a family and what we stand for, what we don't stand for. Maybe I've oversimplified it.
No, that's a good example. Defo.
Thank you. Which kind of, thinking about good examples and good answers, brings us on to the thorny subject of exams again. Because as we were talking before we came on air, the announcement about the cancellation of exams in parts of the UK came out. So we have now got a somewhat fractured system for accountability this academic year, because different children or different students in different parts of the UK are going to be having a very different experience at the end of their phases and stages. So what are your thoughts on that, Tom?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's fair to say that it's a changing thing, and in Wales even, I mean, there are some assessments, it's just they're at different times and there won't be standardised, teachers will be setting them. But in England, yeah, we you know, the detail of what's going to happen isn't there, and it could still be that exams are going to happen. My feeling is this: if I was teaching an exam class now, I'd want them to have something really solid to aim at, because it's really, really hard to teach without that. There's that kind of, and partly it's because we're kind of all sort of we've got the routines around that. That's kind of how it's always been, and it's hard to just sort of flip that over and say, right, we don't do that anymore, until we create a new type of intensity. But it's also I just really believe that students, like, it's like getting ready for a show, you know, a performance. Whenever you've been in a rehearsal and done a show, there's something about the need to perform on the day, which really brings out everyone. The incredible intensity pushes you to a level that you would never reach otherwise. You know, if you didn't have that need to be ready for the show, you wouldn't rehearse as hard, you wouldn't fight as hard to overcome things. And I think that's not how school should be all the time, but I think there's real value in kids experiencing that. And I think without that, I think you pull the rug under, and you've got this sort of slightly nebulous, soft endpoint, which will not just affect the kids in terms of their qualifications that they receive and the grading aspect. It's actually the depth of learning is going to suffer, because they won't be pushed as far and hard as they could have been. I generally think that, and that's part of my experience with it. What I mean, what's your sense of it?
Wrangling with it, I'm just wrangling with it a little bit, because when you're talking about being pushed as far, I'm thinking being pushed as far as they can to meet the criteria in that particular type of assessment, rather than kind of I don't mean studying for studying's sake, or discovering the joy of learning and carrying, you know, lifelong learning and all this business. But I'm just thinking, if we were genuinely talking about depth and breadth of study, and if we were genuinely wanting children to really excel in a particular subject, is just an examination the best way to test that depth and breadth and to motivate them? I'm just playing devil's advocate here.
Not just an exam, but it's got to matter. So, and for me, it's not about it's not the debate just about the kind of the issue around the value of exams and qualifications. It's to do with the actual learning. I really think that. So, for example, I mean, I can remember it from myself, and I've had this discussion with lots of other people. I saw it with my own children. I can remember kind of getting chemistry, kind of, and needing to pass the exam, and just really getting into it, opening the textbook and really studying it, and just really pushing myself to sort of think, oh yeah, okay, that's all makes sense now, because I had to. And my daughter had exactly the same. And we when she did her GCSE chemistry, she suddenly was like, oh my God, chemistry is really cool. She was like, this is so interesting. She chose it to do it for A-level after the GCSE experience was so rewarding to her, because she really needed to get into it finally. It suddenly all clicked to place. And I saw that with my son over English literature, for example. He had to study these poems. And you think people always go on about exams kill the love of poetry. Well, it didn't for him. It like totally turned him on to the rigor and the study aspect of it. So actually, I've seen it happen so often in my own family. I just think, gosh, without that, it's all just, there's nothing like it.
I just think of it, to go along with your performance analogy, is I remember as a young child learning the piano, and I remember that you had to learn set pieces for your examinations. And like you say, it was nerve-wracking, and you would practice those pieces, and you would practice those pieces and practice until you could play them almost blindfold. And you would go in and you would perform them, and you would get assessed to see what grade you were for that particular exam. that didn't necessarily mean I had a deep and really thorough understanding of music, or even the particular composer I'd learn, or the type of piece that I'd learn. It meant I'd learned some stuff that I could replicate for an exam. And that's where the argument that the exam provides the rigor and the depth and the breadth kind of falls apart for me, because I think, yes, you can learn some stuff to get you through a specific syllabus and a specific test, but actually, does that really promote deep learning within that particular subject? It might ignite learning. Like you said, your daughter said chemistry is really cool. It might turn them onto that. But for a lot of children, it will be kind of jumping through hoops to, jumping through the narrowest of hoops to prove something, rather than a real deep, genuine understanding of a subject. And that's where the use of a high stakes test in a small aspect of a subject. I know it's part of assessment. I know it's part of a broader picture of assessment, but actually that being the ultimate test of how much you've learned in that subject, it doesn't.
Well, I get the argument about the different forms of assessment. So, for example, you could debate whether you have to have exams where you sort of answer questions and have to do them in time conditions, versus, say, producing essays over a period of time, or some more extended things, or practical assessments, even oral, vivas and interviews, that kind of thing. There's so many different debates around that. But I still feel that without it sort of needing to really count, and you do need to have an aspect of it mattering and stepping up and delivering. And that's the kind of intensity I think is at risk in this current situation, because where schools will find it hard to recreate that, because people will just think, well, what happened last year was wherever the teacher thought of me, they kind of judged me with the best possible intentions, and it will soften that intensity, and the students won't think as hard. I just don't think it's as easy to say exams sort of are opposite to deeper learning, because my experience teaching in lots of different secondary schools is that exams sort of drive really deep learning, actually, quite often. And of course, there might be some surface aspects to that, but I think those are sort of mitigated by the depth you get through the real drive. And I there's something about that intensity which I think is quite exciting, actually.
You're an exam lover, that's right, Tom.
Yeah.
One thing I will say though, that's an interesting observation from my own practice, and talking to other people who were teaching at the time, was when we used to have Key Stage 2 science SATs, then there used to be this sort of...
I think that's at the end of elementary school. That's for people to... Yeah,
we used to have an end of Key Stage 2 set of examinations. So when the children were 11, before they moved up to the high school, they would be assessed in English, maths and science. And they had tests in English, maths and science. And then in a particular year, the government decided to scrap the science tests. And all of a sudden, the curriculum that was taught in many schools went from being very science rich to there wasn't quite as much science as there used to be. And a lot of secondary teachers would report that actually it wasn't necessarily standards were going down, it wasn't necessarily the children were less capable, but actually the depth of knowledge and skill that they were coming up with, there was definitely a change in what they were seeing. And I know from my own practice as well, I mean, I'm a science trained teacher, so obviously I still kind of kept the science wheel turning. But even in your own head, when you're thinking, there's not that test at the end, there is an element of, it reduces the urgency.
I agree. And also, it reduces the teaching. So when we used to have those assessments so for anyone listening outside the UK, so that would have been what, fifth grade. We did exams then. So students who are 11, and some of the exams were questions in science were things like, now here's the sun going across the sky. How would it look in the summer? Draw the trajectory if it was the autumn, and that to me was a really great question. Like, your students need to know that it's lower in the sky, and they have to explain why. And that was it. And those sorts of questions, I meet teachers now who don't even know the answer. And
It's in one of your books, isn't it?
you need to know it. When you have an assessment, which is a nationally standardized exam, or it doesn't have to be national, but it has to be sort of externally set with a kind of standard attached to it. You look at those assessments and think, okay, we've got to at least meet that standard. And of course, there's a risk of just teaching to the test, like just focusing on that at the expense of all else. Of course there is. But there's also a rigor in everyone knowing the sorts of basic knowledge the children are supposed to have. And now I feel some of them don't. And I feel like there will be students who, without the exam to aim at, will end up with a slightly flabbier, looser set of knowledge than they would otherwise have had. So that's my positive spin on it. And I put my hand up and say, I'm about as pro-exam as you can be, even though I think I'm quite a rounded person. But I recognise there are different perspectives. You know, it is an interesting debate to have, isn't it?
I see. I'm kind of on the fence with exams. I can see the value of them. I totally get them. I totally get the need for standardisation and for rigour and what have you. But there is nothing more soul destroying than knowing that a kid in your class has started writing on a writing paper, completely got the wrong end of the stick, and is just not going to achieve what you thought they were going to, and there's nothing you can do about it. that high stakes accountability is, there's something that needs addressing there, but that's potentially for another day. Right, so we've covered exams. We've dipped into a lot of discussion around exams. So whether we're preparing children for exams or we're preparing children for whatever assessment's going to come their way, one of the things I'm going to recommend, Tom, is this new series of your books. The inaction series. I've read the generative learning one. I'm halfway through reading Ollie's. I'm kind of reading Ollie Lovell of an evening in bed with a cup of tea, just me, tea and Ollie Lovell at the moment for cognitive load theory in action. But do you want to tell us a little bit more about the series, what's coming up and what's in them?
Yeah, so this was something which we started working on in around about May this year, where we had the idea to do more books, a bit like the Rosenshine Principles in Action, and made a list of papers that we wanted to include. And then various people came to mind to kind of write them. And we sort of pitched the idea to all the people at once. And then the first people that came back sort of ready to go. Now, Ollie Lovell's was right at the top because he was already, that was the first one we thought of really. Cognitive load theory, it's talked about a lot. But what do people really know what it is and how to put it in action? And I knew that Ollie had spoken to John Sweller for his own podcast, the ERRR, and had interviewed him for his blog and so on. So I knew that he'd really know a lot about it, and he was totally all over it. And John Sweller was closely involved, read it. That was exciting. The same with the ENTSers, they just took it off. I asked them if they do the generative learning, which is Fiola and Mayer's book, work on generative learning. Again, the two of them worked together. I think it's the first time they'd co-written a book. And it was fantastic. I mean, again, they knocked those out very quickly. So both those books have had the original researchers sort of stamp on it, writing the foreword, which is exciting. And they're sort of short, punchy, and they're very focused on, hopefully, classroom practice. Hopefully that comes through. The next coming up in the spring, John Tomset has got about 15 teachers at his school to write about the idea of cognitive apprenticeship. There's a paper by Collins et al., and they talk about cognitive apprenticeship, which means how do you think like a historian? How do you think like an artist? How do you think like an English? And he, so that's a book, Cognitive Apprenticeship in Action. That Nimish lad, who is a great Twitter blogger person and goes to ResearchEd a lot, and
I love Nimish.
He's fantastic. So he's been in touch with Art Shimomura, and they're doing Art Shimomura's Marge whole brain model, which is something I really think is fantastic in action. So there's this MARGE model for how the brain works, and that's really great. And the other one that's coming out is Kate Jones. She's been talking to Dylan William, and they're doing the formative assessment, five strategies for formative assessment in action. So Kate Jones, who a lot of people know from her work on retrieval practice and so on, is writing that. So that's the next three, and there are some more We've got some other like Sonia Thompson, who's been on our program. She is writing a book about Ron Berger's ethic of excellence. A couple of other people who are coming up as well. So there's about 8 already lined up, and it's proving quite popular. People like the idea of teachers taking research ideas and talking about how they actually work. And I think it's a good sort of recipe for making sense of things.
They're really easy to access as well. They're so readable, and like you say, there's so much credibility in them as well, because these are people referencing exactly what they're doing in their classrooms every day. And this works. This research actually works when you do this. So I think the inaction aspect of them is so important. And I cannot believe, well, I can actually, but the endorsements that you've got from the original writers of the research papers as well. How powerful is that? So you've got that whole circle of the research paper, the series, the class teacher, the whole book. I remember speaking to Nimish in the summer about something else, and he kind of let slip he was writing it, and I was so excited. How I kept a lid on that, I do not know.
Yeah, yes. I mean, all of them. I asked them all to do it, and then they were all quite keen to contact the original author where they could, and so far, I mean, people have been very upbeat about it. So Art Shimamura, he was really chuffed to be asked. So and Nimish has been in touch with him, and Ron Berger, working with Sonia Thompson, for example, that's been great. So, and with John Thompson, Collins, Professor Collins has been giving him really detailed feedback on his chapters, quite direct. He's sort of saying, I'm not sure about this sort of thing. It's good. So it gives you that rigor. But I think it's hopefully, people will value each book, and as a series, once there's a whole stack of them. I quite like the idea of them being like the sort of Ladybird books, where you line them all up along the spine, you've got a whole set. And all I do, literally all I do is I ask the people to do it, and then when they finish, they send it to me, and I say, well done. But that's pretty much it. So I feel like I'm just a kind of... the organizer, but that's been a real joy for me to do it.
They are really great, and they unpick so many of the concepts and the approaches and the research that people may have heard a little bit about or read a little bit about, but translating it into that actual, this is what it looks like in the classroom, it really brings the whole thing to life, and it kind of makes it jump from the research paper into that enactment in the classroom, and because they're so small as well, they're not necessarily really difficult to navigate, really weighty. You don't have to bookmark 3 weeks of your holiday to actually get through them. They're really useful. I read the generative learning in action one whilst my children were at swimming lessons the other day. Sat on the side with my face mask on, reading generative learning in action while they learnt the butterfly.
For me, when I first picked it up, when I first heard generative from Marge, actually the G of Marge that Shimamura wrote, right? That's the first time I really clocked it. And then I thought, it's the same thing as the Fiorella and Mayer. So I love the fact that these things overlap. And to me, that idea that students need to be generative and thinking, and it's such a great concept. It's something which I've probably known about indirectly for decades, but I hadn't really clocked it as a thing until very recently. So it just shows, even though you can be teaching for a long time, ideas come around. In fact, just as a bit of an aside, but I had an email a couple of days ago from a student that I taught in 1989. And I took her to Oxford University on an open day, and she got a place, which I didn't know actually. And she wrote to me saying she just she just picked up that I was on Twitter and stuff, and she said, "Do you remember me? We went to this Oxford field trip, and I did. I totally remembered her name and everything. It's so wild, isn't it? But she's like 50 now, and I'm 55. But that's how life goes. It's great teaching. You have this influence on people years later, and that's quite good. But you don't always understand what you're doing.
I've got a split student at the moment who I taught when he was year 3, which is a very strange situation.
That is a bit strange. Yeah, that is a bit strange. Well, look, thank you very much for reading those books, and I hopefully there are video YouTube interviews with the authors, which are good to see. You can find them on my blog or on YouTube, and So I love that you can access all these people and they talk about their work, and I think that's really great. And we're about to interview Patrice Bain. So in the next episode after this one, you'll see us interviewing Patrice Bain and her excellent work on retrieval practice, powerful teaching, and more. So thank you very much for joining us on the podcast and on our YouTube. And we hope to see you again very soon. Thank you very much from me and Emma.